Thanks, Yuri. Jocelyne, you there? You ready? Jocelyne's going to
Yeah,
start, and I'll share my screen.
so good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot to the organizers of this symposium for giving us the opportunity to share our work in progress as well. Emiel and I will be presenting on behalf of the rest of our team, which includes James Allen, who presented the keynote earlier, Scott Atkinson, Holly Booth, Robert Thatcher, Munir Kanyari, and Omar Saif. And we did this kind of a preliminary analysis estimating the gross cost of global conservation basic income for living in harmony with nature, which is the CBD's kind of vision for future. Next slide. So a brief introduction to the concept of a universal basic income, which I'm sure most people here would be familiar with. It's an unconditional cash payment to everyone in society. And we realize that advocates and naysayers do span the political spectrum. However, we are here at the Post-Growth Symposium, so we do see UBI as a progressive policy to achieve social and economic justice outcomes, such as reducing poverty or wealth inequality, advancing gender parity, freedom from wage labor, and generally improving mental well-being and physical health. We do realize that there are issues that a UBI alone cannot resolve, such as power imbalances or structural inequality, and that the governance mechanisms and institutional context do affect the outcomes that we see. In the context of biodiversity conservation, the most common, sorry, Email the next slide. Thank you. So the most common conservation policies we see are area-based measures such as protected areas that Fiora, Carola, and Sarah we discussed previously in the workshop, and market-based instruments such as payments for ecosystem services. However, these tools tend to enact great social injustices, and they can also fail to achieve both their social and environmental outcomes. So conservation basic income has been proposed recently as an alternative with a different theory of change and to achieve the kind of social and environmental justice outcomes. And it's in general like an unconditional cash payment to humans living near, in, or are impacted by conservation interventions. And we see it as a way of supporting local communities, countering extractive industries expansion, and generally addressing resource overconsumption by richer segments of the global population. So this is a brief visual of how we envision a CBI to achieve socio-ecological benefits. It's a bit complex. In the inner circle, we have immediate outcomes, and in the outer circle, kind of longer term goals. So for example, a lot of resource extraction frontiers happens in conservation areas, and we see a CBI as reducing corporations' ability to kind of prey on the economic vulnerability of the people living there, so that they can kind of better negotiate their enrollment into socially and environmentally degrading forms of labor. The next slide. So kind of our research question would be to advance this discussion on CBI and kind of just put out a gross cost estimate of what a CBI would cost under different conservation scenarios. So we used three kind of slightly different conservation scenario, which James had actually introduced before, so I won't spend too much time on this. The first are key biodiversity areas in light blue on this map, which are generally sites or habitats that are important for species. In yellow, we've got the current protected area state. So these are areas put aside for conservation, mostly by state governments. And in green, we have this future conservation scenario. We have a prioritization scenario for future conservation planning that was actually suggested by James Allen, who presented earlier. And it's the minimum land area that would be required to achieve species conservation and ecoregion targets. So what we did was we overlaid each of these conservation scenarios with a human population count layer. So we calculated the number of people who live within these conservation scenarios for each country. One thing I forgot to point out was that we're only looking at the terrestrial component here, terrestrial protected areas, or the terrestrial component of marine protected areas. And for these populations that live within these conservation scenarios, we multiplied it by a payment rate, one of two payment rates. The first is 25% of GDP per capita, which is kind of proposed within the UBI literature as a basic income. And the other is a fixed rate of $5.50 per day, which was put forth by the World Bank as kind of a value for healthful living. And we summed up this conservation basic income cost for all countries, and particularly for low and middle development countries with a human development index of less than 0.7. And now I'll hand over to Emiel, who will discuss our results and further the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyne. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So there's a lot of different scenarios and different sort of payment rates that we looked at, and I hope we'll be able to share a paper in press soon with which kind of gives the full picture. But I just wanted to go over some of the highlight sort of headline results. So this is a graph that kind of shows the gross costs under different scenarios. You can see from left to right the three conservation scenarios we looked at. So key biodiversity areas, the World Database of Protected Areas, and on the right, the kind of minimum land scenario that James Allen proposed. We have at the top, the global scenario. So what would happen if you calculated these globally, and on the bottom, if you're just looking at lower and medium development countries. And those are defined according to the United Nations Human Development Index as having that below 0.7. In each scenario, we then have the payment rate set at proportional to GDP, or at the flat $5.50 rate that Jocelyne mentioned. And I just want to point out that the y-axis, which represents the gross cost, is not the same between the top and the bottom panels, so just be aware of that. Furthermore, within each scenario, we've kind of color-coded where the payments would go in terms of geographic regions. I'm trying to get to the next slide. So the first thing I want to highlight is just the very large range of outcomes that you get depending on the countries, areas, and payments rates you look at. So we're talking about $79 billion annually when you're looking at just populations in lower and medium development countries living within key biodiversity areas. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have the minimum land. So this is 44% of the world's Earth terrestrial surface globally. And then you're looking at $5.6 trillion, which is obviously a lot more. So we're talking between 0.12 and 6.4% of global economic production. Then in the middle, I've just sort of highlighted what it would look like for the current protected area states. So for example, if you're paying a flat rate of $5.50 per day to inhabitants of protected areas in lower and medium development countries, you'd be looking at a total cost of something like $221 billion. It's important, I think, to note how there's this very almost an order of magnitude difference between the minimum lands and the other two scenarios. What you also see is that when you're looking globally, a GDP proportionate payment usually results in a gross cost that's about double that of the flat rate. But if you're looking at just low and medium development countries, then that relationship is reversed. And this is simply because many countries in the global south have GDP proportionate payments that would be less than the $5.50 per day, which we could consider as the minimum required. Also, in the lower and medium development countries, we're looking at most of the payments, the vast majority going to South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. Whereas if you're looking globally, you would end up having a lot of payments going back to wealthier regions like Europe and Central Europe, especially, I suppose, as well as East Asia. And that's especially so when payments are GDP proportionate. So I just want to put some of these sort of figures into perspective. So I've plucked out kind of three of the main results here. So $5.6 trillion for a minimum land scenario globally, $79 billion for key biodiversity areas in the global south, and $221 billion for current protected areas in the global south. So those are three conservation basic income scenarios. This is the amount that we currently spend on conservation as reported by national governments, $133 billion annually. So you could see that all of the CBI scenarios are quite significant in comparison to current conservation budgets. However, it's now widely recognized in policy and in policy documents like the CBD that conservation spending does have to increase if we're going to meet our conservation goals. Paulson Institute made an estimate of $722 to $967 billion. This is an estimated financing need where they kind of assume expansion of current conservation models, such as 30% protected area coverage. We would suggest that that probably is not adequate and would not address a lot of the problems that we already see with current conservation models, such as the social equity, social justice, and also failing to protect biodiversity in those areas. Another option might be to displace people from those lands. So James Allen mentioned an analysis by the Rights and Resources Initiative. So across the minimum land scenario, to pay compensation to move people out of those lands and have sort of strict protection would cost about $5 trillion, which is quite significant compared to many of our CBI scenarios, and only slightly less than the largest of our scenarios. When we're thinking about where this kind of funding could come from, again, we spend about $500 billion annually in harmful subsidies such as fossil fuels and agriculture, and another $200 billion is evaded from global tax collectors annually. So these costs would be able to cover quite ambitious CBI scenarios. Then, of course, this sort of overarching picture, which is the value of nature. And, the World Economic Forum estimates that $44 trillion of global economic production is dependent on nature. And that does not include all the intangible cultural and spiritual values we get from nature. So in that kind of perspective, even the most ambitious CBI scenarios might be worth thinking about. There's some questions that arise through our analysis. Firstly, what populations might be eligible for these payments? We looked at residents, but we acknowledge that there are also users and others impacted by conservation who don't live in those areas, especially in a marine context. There's questions about indigenous sovereignty, and there's, I guess, a threat that a CBI payment could be sort of imposed and disrupt traditional institutions. There's this tension between desire for conservation outcomes and the principles of autonomy and emancipation that are inherent in the CBI. For example, the CBI could entrench extractive economies, giving people income to buy chainsaws, for example, or induce migration into conservation areas. And although the CBI is unconditional, it is spatially determined. So there is a risk that it could exacerbate conflicts and inequalities between different places. Moving forward, we suggest that although we have this global analysis that can be used in sort of global policy discussions, CBI should really kind of come from the bottom up and be implemented in partnership and with the consent of communities, ensuring that the framing is consistent with local values and concepts, and that governance mechanisms are developed jointly with those communities. It's important to recognize that the CBI should be framed as a rightful share, not as a grant. And the way that CBI is labeled could also help to nudge conservation behaviors. For example, labeling it as a payment in gratitude for conservation efforts or in support of the conservation work done by indigenous peoples and local communities around the world. CBI is also not a replacement or does not work if other rights and services are denied. So provision of public services is also important. Communities need to have their tenure and land rights recognized, and the development of and recognition of local conservation institutions. Piloting CBIs at a local level could help to address a lot of these questions and facilitate learning for the future. So just in conclusion, we kind of recognize that the benefits of conservation are immeasurable, and the benefits of nature are vast, but the costs are borne disproportionately by local people. So indigenous peoples and local communities are often the most effective conservationists, when they're given autonomy and rights to protect the lands. Current or more exclusive conservation approaches are comparably costly and have sort of suboptimal social outcomes. So the CBI is a feasible and promising approach to support these populations as they maintain and conserve global biodiversity. So I'd just like to thank you for listening. I put my contact details on Jocelyne's here on the slide in case anybody would like to reach out. And I'm also going to thank our co-authors who are listed at the bottom. So I look forward to any questions. Jocelyne, you can help me answer them. I see Dr. Kenneth Rijsdijk has raised his hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Emiel Lange and Jocelyne for a really insightful and for me rather econometrical presentation. And I see an interesting complementariness between the presentation by Yuri Sol, who found that there are indications that there is that it is helpful to that the growth of GDP, although I know it's of course very disputed, but yeah. So my question, sorry to be a bit fake, but my question is indeed, is there complementariness between the findings of Yuri Sol that more money would lead to better conservation, and that you actually use that as a kind of basis to propose this idea?
I could share my thought and Jocelyne jump in if you have anything else. I guess we see the relation between poverty and affluence and conservation in the following way, which is that poverty makes people vulnerable, and it makes people vulnerable to inclusion into extractive industry and socially environmentally degrading labor. So in that way, reducing poverty, increasing people's GDP, let's say, in those conservation areas is an effective way to increase their resilience and the resilience of the social ecological institutions that are already in place. However, we do also see that there's a lot of GDP growth that is environmentally damaging, particularly in the sort of global north. That's maybe the real affluence. And the CBI could also form part of a sort of redistribution of that wealth.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, Iago Otero.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really insightful into a new topic for me. Well, I heard about the basic income, but not about the contribution basic income. And I think it's really interesting to have some scenarios and some numbers calculated. My question is, do you know if this has been applied anywhere, like a country or a region or a community conserved areas where this basic income has been applied, and has it been monitored to see, for example, what are the effects on people's livelihoods, on some of the risks you were mentioning, some of the potential benefits?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Conservation basic income as such has not been applied anywhere, though we're aware of a number of proposed pilot studies. One interesting line of evidence that could shine some light here is the effect of other cash transfer schemes that are unconditional with respect to environmental behavior. So we're talking about poverty reduction schemes that are often implemented at a very large scale. There's been studies about those, for example, Brazil's, I think it's the Bolsa Familia project, where they pay unconditional in terms of behavior, but they pay a cash sum to the poorest families. And there's been analysis looking at the environmental impacts of those that show deforestation decreased in those areas. There's also studies in other places like Indonesia that show similar results, but in some countries like Sierra Leone, similar studies have showed kind of mixed outcomes. So they suggest that unconditional cash payments could be good for conservation outcomes when other sort of governance mechanisms are also in place. So I think that's one important lesson for me, is that this is not sort of a standalone policy. It's important that people can also develop the institutions, that they can have the autonomy to manage their lands collectively and so on.
And if I may, a follow-up question, what would be the difference between the unconditioned, the basic income and a standard payment for ecosystem service? It's very, very basic question.
The difference is that a payment for ecosystem services is conditional on the delivery of ecosystem services, which are often monitored and verified. So people have to behave in certain ways in order to receive the payments, whereas a CBI is unconditional. And that's important because it means that CBI doesn't, one of the issues you often see with PES is crowding out of behaviors and motivations. So people often have intrinsic pro-environmental motivations that can be crowded out when conditional payments are made. The CBI is unconditional. It can be framed in certain ways, but it is never withheld based on the behavior or the outcomes delivered. I see a question from Thomas Worsdale.
And I think the
Hello.
last question for this session.
Okay,
Go
I'll be
ahead,
quick.
Thomas.
Thank you. Great. I'm so happy that this research is being done, and I know that it's at the initiation and inception phase. You mentioned a lot of potential problems in Emiel, such as migration to conservation areas, and maybe this is not, it's still being thought, but in terms of CBI being leading to, say, elite capture, as we've seen in issues like PES, is this something that the author team has already started thinking of, or is this something that will have to be developed with the institutions of rights holders in those spaces, or is it something that is like to come, not yet thought of? But if it has been, I'd love to hear if you have anything to say.
Cool, thanks for your question, Thomas. I'd love to know more about your concern about elite capture. I just maybe add one salient point, which is that the CBI will be paid, on an individual basis. So I think there has been some proposal within UBI about payments at a collective level or at a household level, so on. The way we've done our analysis now is at the individual level. So potentially, I don't know if that has any bearing on the issue of elite capture or whether you have other concerns.
Rolling this out would have to go through some form of institution, or where the money is the purse. There's probably going to be some government entity, and it's not necessarily in the mechanism, but it's in the in-between phase, where it's maybe a little bit more confusing, a little bit more per country issue, and you see that even with rights frameworks, which are being abused by particular nation states. So it'd be interesting to see how this develops. We don't need an answer now, of course.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's a really important point to raise, and we don't have any answers, at this point. And I guess that would be something that comes out through practical experience and maybe of implementers locally or nationally.
And just a random thought, maybe similar regulation that prevents speculation on the housing market to prevent people from moving to areas with conservation basic income. So like a minimum amount of time that you need to live there before you become eligible and things like this. Great presentation, Jocelyne and Emiel. Thank you very much. We'll be back in 5 minutes with the next set of presentations by Donnie McLurkin and Gustavo Perez Verdin.